Okay.
And let's share the screen and get started.
He did.
All right, we are in Parshat Emor.
Yes.
Good evening.
Hello. All right. So if you printed out the source sheet, we're going to start with source number 3 because that's really our focus is source number 3.
Okay.
Why can't I get all of you guys on this screen? All right, that'll be good. Okay, so source number 3 comes from the middle of the parsha, the very end of Perek Kaf Bet, the end of chapter 22, and we read as follows. Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe lemor, Shor o chesev o eiz ki valed, vayashivat yamim tachat imo, miyom hashmini vahala yeratzeh lekarban ishela Hashem. If any animal, an ox, a sheep, or a goat is born, it has 7 days to be with its mother, and only from the 8th day onwards may it be offered as a sacrifice. The Shor oseh o tovet beno lo tishchatu biyom echad, and then we have the halacha of what it's called colloquially otovet beno, that you're not allowed to offer a baby animal with its parent on the same day. When you offer a todah, a Thanksgiving offering, you need to be sure that it's of your own free will. Eat it on that day, do not leave over until morning. Keep my commandments and do them. I am the Lord, and this is the pasuk we're really concerned about. Do not profane my holy name. I should be sanctified among the children of Israel. I am the Lord your God. He sanctifies you. Who took you out of the land of Egypt to be for you a God. I am the Lord your God. So we have here this embedded within various halachot about korbanot and when and how animals can be offered, and different rules about when and age limits and things like that. It concludes with this imperative of do not profane my name, and I should be sanctified among the children of Israel. Right? We refer to this typically as the mitzvah of Kidush Hashem, of sanctifying God's name. When we say Kiddush Hashem, Kidush Hashem, what does that typically mean? When we say make a Kiddush Hashem or don't make a Chilul Hashem, what do we mean by that?
I turned off the mute. Come in. You can talk. I don't know.
So typically a Kiddush Hashem, a Kiddush Hashem, means that we do something that it will reflect well on the Jewish people and on God. Right, so every time a teacher brings a group of children on a trip with school, or kids go on a trip with camp, they've got the Kiddush Hashem talk on the bus, which is before, remember, we're representing a Jewish school, everyone knows where you're coming from. Make a Kiddush Hashem, make sure that you behave nicely, that everyone's going to say what nice children those are, right? And the opposite, don't make a Chilul Hashem. Don't act like wild animals, that everyone's going to know that these kids from the Jewish camp, from the Jewish school, are not well behaved, don't have proper manners, etc. So that's typically, colloquially, when we use the term Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem, That's typically what is meant. However, as we'll see, it's how exactly we got to that point is not so simple and is not so obvious from the psukim in which it's based.
Rabbi,
Yes, yes.
in the generation before us, though, because of the intense presence of the Holocaust, when we refer to all of them as Kedoshim,
Right.
because the other meaning of making a Kiddush Hashem is martyrdom,
Correct. So
that's the segue, it seems like, from this sacrifice into this, perhaps, into this pasuk.
Okay, good. So Anne is jumping the gun a little bit, but absolutely correct that the Gemara, when it as we'll see, when it is analyzing these psukim and talking about Kiddush Hashem in the original context, it's talking about martyrdom, or different instances in which one must give their life in order to sanctify God's name. Right, so our use of it when we talk to our kids about making a Kiddush Hashem is kind of an extension of that original concept, or like a new application. But the original concept is always in the context of dying or martyrdom. When we say that someone dies, al Kiddush Hashem, someone who dies sanctifying God's name. And certainly, the victims of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, are referred to as the Kiddushim, as literally the holy ones, because they died al Kiddush Hashem, they died sanctifying God's name. And throughout Jewish history, we have, unfortunately, many instances of others who died al Kiddush Hashem, giving their life to sanctify God's name. So before we get there, though, it's quite interesting. If we look in number 4, the Ibn Ezra is one of the major commentaries. I'll give you the English on our share screen. I'll read the Hebrew. So talking about Lo Techalalu et Shem Kadshi, do not profane or my holy name. Im b'nei Aharon yidaber. Ibn Ezra says that this pasuk, this imperative, is addressed specifically to the Kohanim, to the children of Aharon. Ki haparsha dveika, v'hem hamitzuvim shelo yishchatu lahem ol Yisrael aim uben b'yom echad. And right, because this is all part of one contained unit, and the unit has laws relating to sacrifices, to korbanot. And who is it that offers the sacrifices? The Kohanim, right? So the mitzvah of otovet beno, that you can't slaughter a mother and its child, its offspring on the same day, is certainly addressed to the Kohanim, would be the ones that offer the sacrifices. Right, and also this pasuk we had about when you offer a Thanksgiving offer, it has to be of your own volition. That also seems to be addressed to the Kohanim. The ad right, that and he gives further proof that afterwards, right, the next chapter begins Daber o b'nei Yisrael, meaning that the previous units, I'm sorry, I did not include the opening of chapter 23 in the source sheet, but that's where the Torah begins to give us all the descriptions of the Moadim, of the holidays, and that opens with Daber o b'nei Yisrael, implying that that's a new dibor, a new speech, and that whatever came before the beginning of chapter 23 must relate previously. And that's why we have in source number 2, the beginning of chapter 22, which our verse ends. So the beginning of chapter 22 is Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe Emor, Daber el Aharon ve'el banav, right? And it gives a whole list of commandments to Aharon and his children, to the Kohanim. So the Ibn Ezra maintains that this pasuk, that this imperative of Kiddush Hashem, is directed specifically to the Kohanim, right? We can even go further back, the opening of Parshat Emor, and I did this in chronological order, or in order of textual order, and not in conceptual order. But the Parsha opens in chapter 21 Also, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Emor el Kohanim b'nei Aharon. That we're also, the parsha opens with other commandments given specifically to the Kohanim, and it talks about, it opens with restrictions on becoming Tamei Lamet, coming in contact with the dead, and that it lists only the specific relatives that a Kohen is able to become Tamei, to go to their funeral, to occupy himself with only very close relatives who pass away. But in general, a Kohen is not allowed to become Tamei. So he says the entire parsha is talking about Kohanim. So therefore, this imperative of V'nikdashi b'toch b'nei Yisrael must also be addressed to the Kohanim. The Meshech Chochmah, of Meir Simcha of Devinsk, who lives much later in the 19th century, in the 1800s, says, Omek HaPshat keRabbi Ibn Ezra d'Midaber ala Kohanim. Ibn Ezra says that the Meshech Chochmah says that the Ibn Ezra is correct, that the Pshat, right, before we get into how the rabbis treated these psukim, but the Pshat is certainly like the Ibn Ezra, that this pasuk is addressed to the Kohanim. Right, included in chapters 21 and 22 is restrictions against a Kohen with a mum, a Kohen who has any sorts of physical blemishes of participating in the avoda, in the service in the Beis HaMikdash. So he says that this, right, it's all part of what is addressed to the Kohanim, and it ends with this imperative of, through their service, through their worship in the temple, the Kohanim have the opportunity to create either Chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name if God forbid they get anything wrong, or a Kidush Hashem, a sanctification of God's name if they do things as they're supposed to do and if things go according to plan. So we have one school of thought that maintains that the simple pshat reading of these psukim is that it is addressed specifically to the Kohanim. And we can ask, what is the Kiddush Hashem and what is the Chilul Hashem that may result from proper and improper worship in the temple? What is any ideas, any thoughts on what might the Kiddush Hashem be? Or what would the Chilul Hashem be if they get it wrong, presumably?
I can't help but think of the problem with the Beis HaMikdash, in the time of the Romans, when they had the dilemma of having a sacrifice that had been purposely slit an eyebrow or something like that. It's just haunting me at the moment. And thinking that the Kohanim among them in the discussion, now I don't know how many there were, if there were a majority at that point right there, but they perhaps particularly felt this pasuk, like if one purposely, it seems to others, it seems to at least 10 other Jews, right? That one has purposely not done what one is supposed to be doing when it comes to the laws of the sacrifices too. Not only their own status, I mean, that's one way of interpreting it, the way you just did, but another one is just not following what they're supposed to do. Purposely, that they really were trembling at the thought of what could happen with that in their own lives. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but this really hits it on the head, I think.
Right. So there could be an issue of Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem, right? Certainly, if by following these halachot, it leads to offending anybody or to upsetting the wrong person, as the Gemara that Anne is referencing that we often talk about on Tisha B'Av, right? That if they are to say that we cannot accept your sacrifice, so that has a real potential of creating a Chilul Hashem or creating problems, right? Some might say, well, that is maybe a real Kiddush Hashem, right? That even when it is a sacrifice from the Roman emperor, from the Roman officer, right? That the real Kiddush Hashem is if we stick to the halacha, what halacha demands of us, even when there may be serious consequences. So that's a separate debate. But certainly, right, or if we think to, what just came to my mind is the showdown with Eliyahu and the priests of Baal.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So there was a Kiddush Hashem there, in that the right, only Eliyahu's sacrifice was accepted. Right. But what happens if you offer a sacrifice and the Kohanim go about doing their thing and it's not accepted?
Right.
So that could potentially create a real Chilul Hashem. So certainly when it comes to the service in the Beis HaMikdash, you're literally playing with fire. Right? You're literally in a situation where if things go according to plan, great. But if they don't, then it could very quickly devolve into what we would refer to as a Chilul Hashem, profaning God's name, and really leading to a potential for people to be turned away from Judaism and from Hashem. So there's that very dangerous element which the Kohanim are constantly having to balance. And so it does make good sense that, right, there would be a specific injunction to the Kohanim to be very careful to get things right, so that they will not create a Chilul Hashem, that they won't turn others off or cause others to think badly of God and of the Torah, and that they have, right, and that the flip side of that is they have a real opportunity to bring people close to God if things go as the Torah says they will go. So it makes sense that there would be a specific focus on the Kohanim. And that seems what's driving the Ibn Ezra and the Meshech Chochmah and others that agree with this approach. Any other thoughts on this? Any questions or thoughts? Judy, are you trying to say something? Okay, it looked like you were trying to unmute yourself. However, the Ibn Ezra really kind of, in the end, stands alone in his understanding of it. Chama Leibowitz, for example, summarizing a whole bunch of other Mefarshim, say that the approach of the Ibn Ezra, in source number 6, seems very remote from the plain sense of the text. For were it indeed meant as a warning to the priests to be aware of inadvertent or deliberate deviations from the proper order of the services, it would be a repetition of what we find already in source 6b, right below. Right, we already have a warning to the Kohanim not to profane God's name. The warning of our verse would therefore be redundant. Hence, it is more plausible to see it as a concluding general warning to the entire people of Israel never to profane God's name. Right? She says in 22:2, we have Daber al-Arvon ve'el-banav v'yinazru mikadshei b'nei Israel v'lo yechalalu et shem kadshei asher hem makdishim li ani Hashem. Right? Warn them to be scrupulous about the sacred donations, about whatever is donated to the Beis HaMikdash, to the temple, that they should consecrate me, lest they profane my holy name. So we know in general the Torah is not redundant, does not repeat itself. So since there already was a warning to the Kohanim not to profane God's name, it would be redundant to say that to repeat it again at the end of the parak. And therefore, she says it makes more sense that it's addressed to the entire nation and not just to the Kohanim. The Rambam in Yesodei HaTorah, the laws and foundations of the Torah, in source number 7, writes as follows: Kol Beit Yisrael mitzuvin al Kidush Hashem Hagadol Hazeh. The entire Jewish people is commanded to sanctify God's name. Shene'emar, as it says, and he quotes our verse. V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael, I will be sanctified among the children of Israel. Umusharin shelo l'chalalo, and they're also warned not to profane God's name. Shene'emar v'lo t'chalalu et shem kadshi, not to desecrate God's name, as it says, do not profane my holy name. Ketzah. So how do we do this? How do we sanctify God's name, and how would we, God forbid, profane God's name? Kishe'ya'amud ovid kochavim v'yanos et Yisrael lavor achat mikol mitzvot hamirot b'Torah o yahargenu Ya'avor v'al yihareg. In general, if someone, a non-Jew, stands against you, stands up and says, violate one of the mitzvot of the Torah or I will kill you, in general, we're supposed to violate, to transgress, and not be killed. Shene'emar asher yaseh otam adam b'chai b'hem. Right, that a person should do and live by them. Chai b'hem v'lo sheyamut b'hem, to live by them and not die by them. The imate v'lo avar, and if you choose to give your life in such a situation, then you are, right, it's interesting, he said that you are culpable of your own life. You've already given up your own life. So what does it mean, mitchayev benafsho? So many say that means that you're not even going to earn a place in the world to come if you give up your life when you weren't supposed to. And we're going to get more into this because the Rambam is paraphrasing and dealing with the Gemara in Sanhedrin in 74a. But before we get there to the technical analysis of the psukim, and when, if ever, it's appropriate to give one's life rather than to transgress or one of the mitzvot of the Torah. At the very beginning of this halacha, the Rambam wrote, "Kol Beit Yisrael mitzuvin al Kidush Hashem." The entire Jewish people is obligated to sanctify God's name. So why does it say Kol Beit Yisrael? Right? Normally, when there's a mitzvah, he says mitzuvin, that we have a mitzvah to sanctify God's name. We have a mitzvah to keep Shabbos. We have a mitzvah to eat kosher. Why does he emphasize Kol Beit Yisrael? So Rabbi Chaim Sabato, Arthur, one of Joshua's beloved teachers, actually quotes from Rabbi Rabinowitz, who was the Rosh Yeshiva at Ma'ale Adumim,
We've met him.
and who wrote a very extensive volume commentary on the Mishnah Torah called the Yad Pshuta. So he's actually quoting from Rabbi Rabinowitz here. He says that many commentators have noted Rambam's special emphasis on the entire house of Israel, which he does not specify in any of his other laws. You might conclude from this that the Rambam meant to differentiate his interpretation from Ibn Ezra's. Okay, so it's specifically to say that Ibn Ezra is wrong. Right? It's the mitzvah, the pasuk of Lo techalalu Hashem kadshiv v'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael, not to profane my name, so that I must be sanctified among the children of Israel, is specifically not as the Ibn Ezra says, but it's directed to the entire people and not only to the Kohanim. Okay, so that's So what is the Rambam basing himself on, and what's this Gemara in Sanhedrin? So this is, the English here is a little bit long. I'm not sure that I'll be able to keep the English properly on the screen, but let me at least get us started, and and tell me when it's off screen, and I'll scroll down. So the Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us as follows. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishun Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzadak. Nimnu v'garmu ba'aliyat beit Nadza belud. Right, so they took a vote among the sages who were studying in the attic of a person named Naza or Natza, who lived in Lud, right, which is now where the airport is, where Ben Gurion is located. Kol aveirot shebetorah, imomim ladam avor va'al tehareg, ya'avor va'al yareg. When it comes to any of the 613 commandments in the Torah, if a person tells you transgress or else I'll kill you, we're supposed to transgress and not be killed. Chutz me'avodat kochavim, v'gilui arayot, v'shvichut damim. There's 3 exceptions to this. The 3 exceptions are, it's a case of idolatry. They say, bow down to this idol or I'll kill you. You're supposed to give your life rather than bow down to the idol. Gilui arayot, if they tell you to commit some forbidden act, improper sexual act, ushvichu damim, or they tell you kill someone else or I'll kill you, so you're supposed to give your life rather than kill somebody else. And what's the basis for this? So we'll skip down a couple lines. Sorry, it won't make sense to skip, so we'll just do the whole thing. Avodah kochavim lo. Is it really true that you're not allowed to transgress a case of idolatry, that you have to give your life? right? We have a teaching from Rabbi Shmuel that says if a non-Jew comes and tells you you must bow down and you must worship this form of idolatry, or else I'll kill you, that you're supposed to worship and not be killed. How do we know this? Because it says v'chai b'hem v'lo sheyemu b'hem. It says live by them and not die by them, and this is what the Rambam quoted in source number 7. Yachol afilu b'farhesia. You might think that this is true even if it's done in public, if it's done in the presence of a minion, is how public is defined. Talmud Omar, v'lo techalalu et shem kachi v'nikdashti. Right? No, that's why what our pasuk comes to teach us. Do not profane my name, and I will be sanctified. Meaning that if there is a crowd, if there is a quorum, if there is 10, there's actually very interesting discussion among the commentators. If the minion here, the public that we're talking about, is specifically a minion that we would daven with, or if women are counted in the quorum of 10 that would be included. If minors are included, right, there's discussion, does this include, what if it's a mix of Jews and non-Jews? So there's very interesting discussion among the Mefarshim about what exactly is meant here. But putting the details aside, right, fundamentally, if it's in public, so then we are obligated to give our life, and the reason for that is because of this mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. So then we can skip a little bit of the detail that's discussed about various other sources for this, other psukim that are suggested as sources for this. So I'm skipping down to where it says Gilui Arayot, illicit sexual relations. I'm sure we're on to the next page in the English. Let me see if I can find it quickly. Yeah, from where is it derived? And if I highlight it, will you see the highlight? You see that?
Is that what he's referring to? With Rabbi Yishmael, or is it further on?
Further on. From where is it
Further
derived that one must allow himself to be killed rather than transgress the prohibition of forbidden sexual relations and the prohibition of bloodshed? So this comes from Rebbe, from Yehuda Hanasi. Let me go down a little bit more so we won't stop in the middle. Ditanya, as it was taught. Rebbe Omer, Rebbe teaches, it says, right, well, this is similar to when someone rises up to kill someone else to commit murder. Right, so in the case of a Ne'ara Morsa, the case of a betrothed woman who is raped or who is taken against her consent. So there the punishment is that the person who did this to her is put to death. And it's compared to a case of murder. Why is it compared? So both cases, you're allowed to kill the criminal, the one committing the crime, rather than allow them to continue. And there's another reason why these two instances are juxtaposed or compared to each other. Just as in the case of murder, one must give their life rather than murder someone else. The same is true with the case of Na'ara Ma'orsa, and by extension, all other cases of arayot, of illicit sexual relations. Rotzeach gufe minalan, and how do we know that in the case of murder, one has to give their own life rather than kill someone else? Svarahi, it's based on a logical deduction. What's the logic? Huda atala kami derava amarli mari dorai zio katle liplania bilo katle nilach. There was a person who came to the sage Rava and said to him, "Kill such and such, or else I'm going to kill you." Amarle lik talucha. You should allow them to kill you. Viloti katel, and don't kill someone else. Mi yamer didami didach sumak tefei dilmadama dehugava sumak tefei. Who can say that your blood is redder, that is more red than the other person's? Maybe their blood is redder than you. So we have a logical deduction that says that we're not allowed to, that we have to give our life rather than kill someone else. It's a little bit of a technical Gemara, but what the Gemara is telling us is that when it comes to these three cardinal sins, the halacha is that we have to give our life rather than transgress. And it's based, at least in part, from our pasuk of V'lo techalu l'shem kachi v'nikdashti b'toch bnei Yisrael. Do not profane my name, and I shall be sanctified among the children of Israel. And just the Gemara continues. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Let's just get the English here. Rabbi Yochanan said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Lo shanu ela shelo bishar gzerat hamalchut. Aval bishar gzerat hamalchut afila mitzvah kala yehareg v'al yavor. So this is true that it's only in regard to the three cardinal sins that one must give their life rather than transgress, if it's not a time of persecution against the Jews. But if there's a time of persecution, all right, Gzerat HaMalchut, right, state-sponsored persecution, Filu mitzvah kala yehareg v'al yavor. In such a situation, then we must be willing to give our life even for a light mitzvah or an easy commandment. So from this conclusion is, generally where the notion that those who died in the Holocaust, those who died in other times of persecution, died al Kidush Hashem, died by sanctifying God's name, is because it was a time of persecution and there was general decrees against the Jews, and so in doing so they died al Kidush Hashem by sanctifying God's name, and that, according to Rabbi Yochanan, was the proper thing to do. Right? Many heart-wrenching tshuva responsa have been written about various situations and what is the proper thing to do. When, right, is it ever appropriate to try to save yourself, save others in these circumstances? Very, very, very difficult tshuva to read and to see, what happened and what the decisions that were being made. Okay, so are there any questions? This was a technical Gemara, and really we should spend more time with it than we're going to allow ourselves to tonight. But are there any questions, or anyone have any thoughts or need clarification on what we said on this Gemara? Okay, so let's go to number 11, and then we'll come back. Actually, no, we'll stay in order. So Rabbi Sabato again, noting that, right, ultimately the requirement to sanctify God's name through martyrdom comes from our pasuk, right? V'nikdashti b'toch bnei Yisrael, I shall be sanctified among the children of Israel, right? So he says that the requirement to sanctify God's name through martyrdom stems from the obligation to proclaim his name in public. Thus, the concluding verse of the passage on sanctifying God's name states, "Who took you out of the land of Egypt to be a God to you, I am God." The exodus from Egypt involved proclaiming his name to the world and publicizing it before all the nations. When God chose Israel to be his people at that time, he commanded them to be sanctifiers of God and proclaimers of his name in the world. So just driving home the textual basis to support the Rambam and really everyone besides the Ibn Ezra and the Meshech Chochmah who follow the rabbis in the Gemara and say that this, our pasuk, is addressing the entire Jewish people, not specifically to the Kohanim, and that it's telling them of the requirements to create a Kiddush Hashem, to sanctify God's name, and that, however the details of that requirement play themselves out. The Rambam writes, we're in Hilchos Tshuva, and he's talking about Yom Kippur. He's talking about the various ways in which Yom Kippur is effective in atoning for a person's sins, and the various ways in which it's not. So this is one that is often studied around the Yamim Noraim, around the high holidays, so it might sound familiar. I'll begin, and then we'll skip to the relevant piece. Alpha pisha tshuva mechaperet al hakol, v'itzumo shel Yom HaKippurim mechaper. Right? Tshuva in general atones for any sin that a person creates. In Yom Kippur, the essence of Yom Kippur also has atoning qualities. Even though that's generally the case, he says, Yesh averot she'ein mitkaprin l'sha'atan, v'yesh averot she'ein mitkaprin ela la'achar zman. Says there are some sins which can be atoned for immediately if you go about the proper tshuva process, and some which are only atoned for after a period of time. Ketza, how is this so? Avar adama mitzvata say she'ein ba karit, v'asa tshuva, person transgresses a positive commandment whose punishment is not karit. Right? The person does not wear tzitzis on a four-cornered garment. The asa tshuva, and then they do tshuva for this. Eno zaz misham ad shemocha mimo. Right? As soon as you do tshuva, you're immediately forgiven. Avaro mitzvah lo ta'aseh she'ein ba karit. You transgress a negative commandment, which also doesn't have a punishment of karit. V'lo mitat beit din, and there's no other, right? There's no punishment of death by rabbinic court. V'asa tshuva, and you do tshuva. So tshuva tova v'yom HaKippurim mechaper. Tshuva kind of hangs in abeyance until Yom Kippur comes. And once you've done proper tshuva and you've gone through a Yom Kippur process, then you're atoned. Probably most familiar to us. Where is it? Why am I not seeing it? Right. So he also gets into the distinction between mitzvah ben adam l'makom and ben adam l'chavero. That this general rule about Yom Kippur and Shuva working is true when it comes to mitzvot that are ben adam l'makom, that are ritual, that are between man and God. But mitzvah ben adam l'chavero, if it's interpersonal, you always have to appease the person that you offended, that you sinned against. There's no magical cure. You have to go through that process before any atonement is achieved. So he says, including, and this is the part that's relevant to us, and this is bolded on the source sheet. When does all this hold true? Right? As long as you did not profane or blaspheme God's name at the time when you committed the transgression. But if you desecrate God's name, even if you did tshuva, v'higia Yom HaKippurim, and Yom Kippur comes, and you still are sincere in the tshuva that you might have done before Yom Kippur, and you receive, you got some sort of physical punishment, some sort of suffering. If the sin involves Chilul Hashem, if God's name was somehow profaned by the sin that you committed, the only way you can get full atonement is by death. Okay, so Chilul Hashem is taken quite seriously, right? Quite seriously here. And it's interesting to think, what exactly does he mean by Chilul Hashem, right? Does he mean that that your shul group, your school outing misbehaved at the museum, or upset somebody in the park during their Lag BaOmer picnic? Or does it mean literally that you blaspheme, that you somehow say something against God's name in the sin that was committed? Is there a public element? Again, all sorts of really important questions that we're not going to get into right now, but this notion of Chilul Hashem, we see, is a very, very, very serious notion, and again, seems to be coming from our pasuk in our parsha, Lo techalalu et shem kadshiv v'nikdashtu b'toch b'nei Yisrael. So, what I wanted to conclude with was the question: if it's such a serious issue, and if it is there's such severe ramifications, why the ambiguity? Right? Why does the Torah, why does Hashem leave room for the position of the Ibn Ezra? Why allow for the, right, why is this put really in the context of the Kohanim? Right, we have an entire parsha, Parshat Emor, the first half of which deals with the Kohanim and rules of the Kohanim. And at the very end of that parsha, we're given this commandment of Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem. Why does it come there? Right, it could have come anywhere else in the Torah. There's no thematic, there doesn't seem to be any essential connection. Anyone have any thoughts before we get into what's on the source sheet?
I haven't looked ahead there, but Hashem started his direct communication with the Bnei Israel before Shavuos by saying, "You are to be Kohanim to me." And so perhaps the ambiguity is there in order to raise the question of what is the dimension of being a Kohen that we all share.
Okay, beautiful.
And thank you. And I was just thinking of, like at Sukkot time, for example, some people, when they invite Aaron, a Kohen, to the Sukkah, they may do it in the sphere of order. If they do, it coincides, interesting, this week with the whole issue of humility, which is just, that's the sphere mainly of this week. Like tonight is, I believe, Tiferes of Hod. So to be studying the Torah, Tiferes, about what the degree of humility that one should have when thinking about the power of Hashem. I mean, blasphemy is like saying Hashem is not so great and her in some way, even using the name of Hashem or denigrating Hashem in some way in their speech, or some would say just not keeping a mitzvah is equivalent to that. I don't know about all of that, but maybe so. But it implies that Hashem does not have the power and the wisdom and the transcendence and the coming from another place, all of those things. So it creates a Chilul, and the shorish of Chilul means a hole or a void, a separation from Hashem.
Right.
It's like a person saying, there's just really not room in the universe for both me and Hashem, almost,
Okay.
Like
okay.
Hashem is wide. And I don't know, I kind of tend to think of it in those terms, maybe.
Okay, beautiful. So Anne, everyone can look ahead to the pasuk that we was just quoted from Shemot chapter 19, right? And this is we're going to read this on Shavuos, right? Right before Hashem gives us the 10 Commandments at Har Sinai. The sort of mission that we're given is Atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. You should be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy people. Right? What does it mean to be a kingdom of priests? It means that in some way we are supposed to all become, or supposed to embody what a Kohen represents. And so interestingly, as an aside, Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests, there's one common thing that kind of binds together, a common denominator between a king and a Kohen, and that is the color Techelet. Right, that the king, right, Techelet was seen as a royal color, and the Kohen would have the tzitz, the crown that the Kohen wore was tied with a string of Techelet.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then the entire nation is given the mitzvah of Techelet, to wear Techelet with as part of the tzitzit. So we sort of live that mission in our, right, on a daily basis, to become a kingdom of priests. So what does it, right? So with that in mind, it's interesting, right? We'll start go back now to number 12, Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, whom Nechama Leibowitz quotes quite often, right? So in we sort of saw, right, we already saw the proof text that she brought, that the Torah had already warned the Kohanim specifically against Chilul Hashem. So he writes, in conclusion of the laws of concerning holiness addressed to the priests, in whose goal is Kiddush Hashem, comes to the exhortation, and you shall keep my commandments and do them. This is followed by the ultimate injunction, you shall not profane my holy name, the pasuk that we've been focusing on. The admonition of verse 2 addressed to the priests is here repeated and directed to all the people of Israel. Right? So as she said, even Ezra's wrong. Our pasuk can't be directed to the Kohanim because we already had a pasuk directed specifically to the Kohanim not to create a Chilul Hashem. But the pasuk at the end of this chapter amplifies what was said to the Kohanim, so that given that it's now addressed the entire nation, you have the entire nation sort of echoing and buying into and being commanded in the same way that the Kohanim were previously. In the former verse, the command refers to the laws of purity of the holy things, whereas in the latter, it constitutes a general principle. And Rabbi Sabato spells it out a little bit more explicitly. Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman argues that the plain meaning of verse 32 follows the sage's interpretation, since it concludes the passage on holiness that began in Parashat Kedoshim and was spoken to all of Israel. This sheds light on Rambam's application of this mitzvah to all Israel, as opposed to those who believe it applies only to the priests. Just as the priests are commanded to avoid desecrating the holy offerings of the temple, so all Israel are sometimes called priests. As the prophet Isaiah declares, you shall be called priests of God. Perhaps the Torah juxtaposes the mitzvah of sanctifying God's name to the other mitzvah of the priests in order to recall this comparison of Israel to priests. For this important mitzvah, each one of Israel is like a priest before God and commanded to sanctify his name. And I'll just conclude a Mishnah that I think was in the first parak of Pirkei Avot, right, where the Mishnah says that there are 3 crowns, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are the 3 crowns? Keter Torah, Keter Kahuna, and Keter Malchus, right? That there's a crown of the crown of Torah, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of kingship. The Keter Shem Tov Al Kulan, but the crown of a good name, right? Really, the 4th crown, it prevails over all of them, right? But that one of the differences between the first 2 and the other crowns is how is the crown of Malchus achieved? How does one get a crown of kingship, of kingdom? It's inherited, right? That you're born into it.
Yeah, and you have to be anointed.
Yeah. And how does one become, how does one get the crown of kahuna?
It's inherited also.
Also, right? You're born into it. If you're born a Kohen, you're a Kohen. If not, then tough luck, right? But then there's Keter Torah. Then there's the crown of Torah, the crown of Shem Tov, of a good name, which can be earned, right? So playing in this very idea that our mission and the ultimate goal is to become like Kohanim. Not that we all have to strive to serve in the Beis HaMikdash and offer the sacrifices and, be the teachers, that's all very nice. But that ultimately, that our mission is to become like the Kohanim, and how do we do that? By sanctifying God's name, by making the Kiddush Hashem. Which, as we said, is not applied only in situations of martyrdom, right? It's interesting, the Gemara at the end of Brachos tells us of Rabbi Akiva, who said, my whole life I wanted to be able to fulfill this imperative to give my life for the glorification of God, right? With the whole meodecha, with the whole nafshecha, with all your soul, right? And so then it tells us about Rabbi Akiva's martyrdom. So there's an interesting dynamic about how much do we romanticize and how much do we sort of play up the idea of martyrdom. Very interesting things have been said about and written about this. But that we can, through sanctifying God's name, through bringing others close to God, through not creating a Chilul Hashem, we can in our own way embody what it means to be a Kohen, to be priests and representatives of God in this world. And I think that's the ultimate message. That's sort of the idea for tonight. Are there any final questions or thoughts on this?
Just one, that the mitzvah for education comes also in the context of the Kohanim.
Uh-huh.
And so Yasher Koach to you, Rabbi
Thank you.
Kaplitz, for teaching us so nicely and being like a Kohen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very good. Yeah, it
All
was
right.
so powerful a session.
Thank you. So I apologize for the confusion with the link. We'll get that straightened out for next week. And have a good night, everybody. Bye,
Thank you.
Same to you.
Thank you.
Good Shabbos.
Laila Tov.
Bye, Latov.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.